I learned about the fundamental attribution error when I was a freshman in college and took my first psychology course, and I found this to be one of the most useful things I've ever learned. When I'm trying to understand why other people do the things they do, I'm very careful to think about the role of the situation. When I'm on my bike and some car cuts me off, I try not to assume that the driver isn't some jerk who ought to have his license revoked. Instead, I try to think about how hard it is for me to see bikes on the road sometimes when I'm driving, and how often I get a little distracted while driving and sometimes miss things. I've also found that the fundamental attribution error helps to explain some of the occasional conflicts I see between the students in my lab. When two students have conflict, they tend to attribute each other's behavior to their internal personal deficiencies rather than to the situation. If student A smiles at student B, but student B doesn't smile back, student A assumes that student B is just an unfriendly person. But maybe student B didn't see student A smile, or maybe student B just had an argument with a friend. And once student A decides that student B is unfriendly, then the confirmation bias kicks in and student A only notices the negative things about student B. Student B then starts feeling badly treated by student A, and then student B actually starts being unfriendly. Not because of a stable personality characteristic, but because of the situation. When conflicts start escalating between two students, I often meet with each student and explain the fundamental attribution error and the confirmation bias. I ask them to think more carefully about what they see in the other student's behavior, and to think about whether the other student's behavior might be attributable to the situation rather than to the student being some kind of unredeemable jerk. This often seems to help. So, when you find yourself thinking that one of your friends or roommates or coworkers is just a bad person, you should think about whether some of that person's behavior is really just a result of the situation. And you should think about whether you've started to form a negative opinion that's leading you only to see the negatives and not to notice the positives. You might find that people aren't really so bad after all. After all, social psychology has documented over and over again that people may act in ways that aren't consistent with their values and ideals in some situations. Remember the Milgram obedience experiment, where 65% of the people gave the maximum shock of 450 volts? A researcher named Gunter Bierbauer had a group of research participants watch a reenactment of the experiment, and these participants judged that the people who delivered the 450 volt shocks must be unusually aggressive or obedient people. They failed to appreciate that, in this situation, the majority of people will obey the experimenter. Instead of attributing the behavior to the situation, they attributed it to the negative personality characteristics of the participants. You should also think about the role that the fundamental attribution error plays when people make a variety of broad social and political judgments. For example, if you try to make a judgment about the German people from their behavior during World War II, it would be tempting to assume that they went along with the Nazis because they were bad people, not because of the situation. Another example is how poor people are judged. If someone lives in poverty, do we attribute that to their intrinsic characteristics or to their challenging situations? Do we assume that they're lazy and dumb, or do we assume that perhaps they grew up with reduced educational and economic opportunities? The fundamental attribution error says that people are likely to attribute poverty to the individual, not to the situation. An interesting example of this comes from Paul Ryan, a conservative congressman from Wisconsin and currently the Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives. For many years, he would distinguish between makers and takers. Makers were people who held good jobs and made a productive contribution to society. Takers were poor people who didn't contribute and instead lived on welfare and other social assistance programs. His assumption was that poor people had intrinsic personality characteristics that caused them to be takers who lived off the taxpayers rather than doing the hard work necessary to be makers. In other words, he was attributing poverty to the internal characteristics of the people rather than to their situation. But eventually, Ryan realized that most poor people don't want to live on public assistance programs. They want to work hard and contribute to society, but because of their circumstances, they just can't find a way out of poverty. For example, as we discussed earlier, just having a particular name can impact your employment prospects. Ryan eventually came to the realization that he shouldn't attribute poverty to intrinsic personality characteristics of the people who are poor. Instead, he realized that most people are poor because of their situations, In other words, he stopped making the fundamental attribution error. And whether or not you agree with his political views, you have to be impressed that he took the unusual step of publicly admitting that he had changed his perspective.